So our first speaker today is Ruth Kettle-Frisby, and she is a member of Romford Meeting, and she's been looking at how people of faith can accompany women and disabled people in the Global South. Over to you, Ruth.
Hi, I'm Ruth and my academic background is in philosophy. I'm currently a full-time carer to my eldest daughter who is disabled and my youngest who is still quite small. I represent Romford Quakers in our borough's climate coalition and I regularly speak truth to power locally. I was inspired in 2022 by Ros Martin's 9th Bristol Annual Peace Lecture, the Sam Sharp Lecture by Kahindi Andrews, the Swarthmore Lecture by Professor Helen Minnis, and by Woodbrooke's 2 climate justice courses to think about cultivating the spirit of accompaniment for Quakers in the context of climate justice for women and girls of colour and disabled people. This is intended as a project of truth-telling in all its ugliness, but also to look at how we might begin to construct new pathways together, to emerge from the warmer waters that Professor Helen Minnis illuminated in her Swarthmore lecture, and to make a start on the work of true systemic overhaul, to explore what it might look like if we hold hands and dive into chillier waters together. My method is a combination of information sharing and a series of dialectic reflections. The purpose being to start to bring marginalised narratives into Quaker spaces and also to try my best to participate in what this research calls Quakers at large to do. Why focus on women and girls of colour and disabled people? Because women, girls of colour and disabled people are on the front lines of climate breakdown in the Global South, because of the pervasiveness of what Bell Hooks refers to as interlocking systems of classism, racism and sexism that work to keep women exploited and oppressed. Because ableism, a term coined in the 1980s by US feminists, is a construct in our society that is designed to be advantageous to non-disabled people and therefore excludes disabled people. In the truthfully blunt words of Kerry Lotsoff, climate change is sexist. In 2021, she interviewed Dr. Maisha Alam, who believes that while the link between gender and climate change is not necessarily obvious to most people, in all societies, women and girls are like the canary in the coal mine. You can tell a lot about the health and stability of a society based on the quality of life for women. Fiona Harvey, writing recently for The Guardian, notes that people with disabilities are among the most vulnerable to climate impacts, partly because of the nature of their disabilities, and also because of the social disadvantage that often accompanies this. However, this fleeting two-pronged analysis of vulnerability may indicate just how entrenched and disabling this form of oppression is. Disabled people are not in fact disadvantaged, in Harvey's words, due to the nature of their disabilities, which can be complex, but rather they are disabled by structural and systemic barriers within society. Even the term vulnerable is not in any straightforward way as helpful as we intend. Indeed, the portrayal of disabled people as vulnerable represents the ableist assumption that disabled people are unable to contribute to climate adaptation and discussions. However, this is far from the truth, in the words of Jake Clark. So what can we do as Quakers for climate justice? Where am I with conversations about climate justice? I'll start with reflecting truthfully and openly is a good place to start, and I think a necessary condition for accompaniment. And so I begin my research on a personal note in this spirit. I am a woman and I'm also structurally advantaged in many ways. However, I've been personally humbled by circumstances throughout my life, and I've felt able to step back and scrutinise systems of oppression without much cognitive dissonance, making it easier for me to process difficult truths about ongoing systemic harm rooted in British colonialism. I can only really imagine how stressful this might feel for someone who, say, cherishes their sense of belonging or national identity, rooted perhaps in the sense of rich familial inheritance. We live in a society that, based on no consciously chosen ideology and no concerted effort of personal agency of our own in most cases, privileges white, non-disabled, middle to upper class adult men, and informs the narratives and roles that shape our social hierarchies of intersecting oppression. What is needed ultimately is transformation, both in ourselves and in our systems. We start from wherever we are. What's important is that we get started from somewhere. The following definition of accompaniment evokes transformation to me when I read it. Accompaniment begins with stopping and noticing, crossing over the invisible lines that separate us. It also crucially depends on understanding that as far as apart our individual fates seem from one another, they are ultimately connected. To walk right by, to pretend that others do not exist, compromises our personal integrity. Walking right by negates the potential solidarity we could achieve. This train of thought always puts me in mind of how I was taught to visually conceptualize Spinoza's metaphysics, that far from existing in little vacuums that are ontologically independent of each other, we all constitute existence as a whole. We are but modes of the same singular substance, each of us like a ripple of the same water. The point of the analogy here is not about metaphysics, including questioning free will or anything like that, but just to try to visualize new narratives to help us to see past toxic individualism, which does its best to other and thus to disguise our essential interconnectedness. What we have thought of as progress since the Industrial Revolution is starting to be put into reverse in climate-conscious sustainability circles, and we are looking to other models of indigenous knowledge that predate our own. Perhaps we need to pare our socially constructed senses of self back a bit too, to something more fundamental and eternal. Indeed, we allow ourselves to be accompanied to some extent by early Quakers when we realise how some of their insights are true today as they were at the time. Michael Lee in 1976 wrote that it is not enough to go over our own behaviour in detail, cutting a bit here, pulling back a bit there. We must be concerned with our and society's attitude to life as a whole, to live answerable to the design of our creation. The spirit of accompaniment is, I think, a good candidate for the basis on which to construct healthy, trusting networks for change and ultimately to reimagine society. Accompaniment is often conceptualized in terms of pathways, to deviate from other pathways for a while and then forever, to walk with those on the margins, to be with them, to let go. Accompaniment is an idea so radical and difficult for us to comprehend that its power and significance reveal themselves to our Western and Northern minds only slowly and with great difficulty. That was the first quote I'd heard about accompaniment through Woodbrooke. Prior to thinking about how best to accompany people on other pathways, I found it interesting to look at the nature of different pathways in broad terms. We're all different and all have individual pathways in a sense, but they overlap where we share our pathways and meet each other at crossroads, junctions and roundabouts. There seem to be a multitude of interchanging networks of pathways available to some and not others. Why is this? And why can some pathways be characterized as well-maintained main routes to opportunity, while others are perilous roads to survival at best? In an attempt to grapple with the concept of accompaniment and unpack the concepts, feelings, and perspectives to which it alludes, I've written 2 dialogues between fictional friends, Hope and Lyssa. In Greek mythology, Lyssa was the spirit of rage, which I argue is a misunderstood and underappreciated emotion. These dialogues to some extent reflect my own spiritual progress based on doubts, conversations, books, webinars, public lectures, and breakout rooms. The characters are not representative of one person, but they do represent a way in, a test run, so that we can observe a dialogue and see how we feel about the views they're in without attaching them to particular people or taking personal risks before we're ready. The characters Hope and Lyssa accompany each other as they attempt to find clarity about the spirit of accompaniment itself, guided by the following questions. What is the nature of a pathway? Do we freely choose our pathways? If we do, to what extent is this possible? The two friends make concerted efforts to listen to each other in good faith and according to the principle of charity, which is an interpretation that maximizes the truth or rationality of what others think and say. At the end of the dialogue, the friends are asked what they've learned, whether they've changed, and where they have arrived for now.
The systems themselves need to be dismantled. For many white, non-disabled people living in the UK, none of the hardships we've directly experienced have resulted from structural oppression.
I feel like you're thinking philosophically about this, idealistically even. I'm a pragmatist, and the danger of using philosophy to question macro structures is that this kind of discussion takes the place of actually doing something useful. We need to effect change from the inside and work within the structures we've got.
We agree that we should build new pathways, and we should do so together without leaving anyone behind. But how?
What follows in the research is an exploration of the spirit of accompaniment under the following headings: national and individual pathways. Litter and Hope returned for a second dialogue that is said to take place several years later, whereupon the seeds that were planted in the spirit of accompaniment start to grow together and personal transformation takes place, as it did in my own heart. What follows after that are suggested principles for Quakers to think about in 3 sections. Inner groundwork concerning suggested personal prerequisites for spiritual transformation, then the spirit of accompaniment in action and what this might look like for Quakers, and then finally taking care, what the spirit of accompaniment is not. So, starting with inner groundwork, to discover and then bear witness to truths about the causes of climate change and the structures that continue to perpetuate inequity in our society. This section explores colonialism, past, present, and unconsciously internalized, for it is colonialism and not the Industrial Revolution, which was financed by the blood money and infrastructure of slavery and colonialism, that caused climate change. Personal commitments to deep-seated ongoing spiritual transformation depend on reflexive education. Do I regularly examine myself for attitudes and behaviour that indicates any hidden prejudice regarding race, gender, sexual orientation, disability or class? This section explores white supremacist knowledge systems, epistemic disobedience, and ongoing unlearning, and new lenses through which to interpret reparative justice. Until we as a religious society begin to question our assumptions, until we look at the prejudices often very deeply hidden within our society, how are we going to be able to confront the inequalities within the wider society? We are very good at feeling bad about injustice. We put a lot of energy into sticker plastering activity, but we are not having any effect in challenging the causes of inequality and oppression. I do sometimes wonder if this is because we are not able to do this within and among ourselves. I'm a woman who feels angry, ashamed, frightened, and sad about climate injustice. But I'm not writing here to apologise for having emotions, to sweep them under the carpet, or to pretend, while I strongly support C&D, for example, and non-violent methods of campaigning, that striving for peace is itself an entirely tranquil process emotionally. I really don't think it can be. Emotions are, it seems to me, how we experience, evaluate, communicate our shared humanity. The philosopher Hume said that reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions. Commonly understood to mean that facts on their own don't tend to motivate moral action. And interestingly, a recent paper reports findings along these very lines. The authors suggest that enhancing emotion through climate communication may be a promising tool for counteracting biased assimilations of controversial scientific information and for engaging audiences who might otherwise dismiss or avoid the issue of climate change. And according to another, the first trigger to any form of personal and collective change begins with emotions. Emotions are thus at the centre of social responses to climate change. So not only do our emotions function to engage us in climate change conversations in the first place, they can actually motivate us to take action. However, it may not surprise any of us to hear that what Olivia Gilberto discovers about this, that Brits, according to many outsiders, are reserved, repressed, resilient, unemotional and self-controlled. He goes on to share that the situation is improving, but concludes that to say Britain is no longer repressed is way off the mark. As peace-promoting Quakers, we too are starting to recognise the place of emotion in our actively lived faith. Chris Rose recently entertained the possibility that we need more difficult Quakers. And yes, sometimes in order to show that love, we need to show a passion, nay, an anger. Yes, even rage. Indeed, Rennie Edo Lodge observes that no youthful movements for change have ever sprung out of fervent guilt. Instead, get angry. Anger is useful. Use it for good. I like this quote by Aldous Huxley. I hope we can learn to live with, listen to, and learn from our emotional responses to injustice with less caution and negation, and to distinguish harmful emotional reactions to social injustice, such as undeserved guilt and wallowing self-pity, from healthier ones. As peaceful white Quakers, perhaps we can focus on defying existing neural pathways that lead from anger to conflict, aggression, or perception of gendered hysteria, in order to try to put the raw emotions of anger or even shame in some context to use. White with a capital W, denoting the epistemology of whiteness, or the structural inheritance of our past. It's important that we manage our emotional responses, I think, because their expression can harm marginalised communities, and failure to process them can harm ourselves and our faith-based climate action. What can emotions teach us? I'm going to carry on because of time. Some of the answers to these questions that I explored were surprising. In this section, I looked at white fragility, reparative wisdom in unexpected emotions, and the truth that emerged from this. That the spirit of accompaniment asks us to situate ourselves not in social and geographic vacuums or echo chambers, but in amongst our interlinking network of others. In the words of Mary Watkins, solidarity emerges from a felt sense that our fates are interdependent and that our well-being cannot be separated from others. To give an example, the refusal to accept shame, I didn't do anything personally, rests on an individualized understanding of society. But when we realize that we are inseparable, we start to understand through the spirit of accompaniment that not only does our mere existence and way of life connect us indirectly to past, present, and future injustices, the faith and friendship we value as Quakers provide us with a good place to start to actively contribute to change. Shared groundwork activities. We can use the principles of critical dialogue in small groups together, something I've been learning about and practicing with XR, to encourage climate justice discussions guided by statements. Questions for reflection are a good way to guide transformative discussions, and I provide a series of questions to guide what I've been expounding about the spirit of accompaniment in the context of climate justice. Friends can also use Stuart Masters' illustrated resource on responding to ecological crisis, Quaker spiritual insights, and the guided reflections in Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad. Once we've, in a sense, accompanied ourselves inwardly, as well as each other, where we feel comfortable enough to do so, for example, during Woodbrooke courses, allowing the roots of transformation to take place, we can think about the spirit of accompaniment itself and what it might look like. So, firstly, tell the truth. Tell the truth, climate change is sexist. It is women who bear the brunt of climate change. I haven't got time to read these out, but this is personal testimonies from women. The clear truth that emerged from cultivating the spirit of accompaniment was that it's really important not only to tell the truth about climate change being sexist, but to appreciate that this is because of structural oppression, not inherent vulnerability. Climate justice and disability rights are intertwined, codependent, and reinforce one another. To tackle the climate crisis and strive for a fair and just world, we must bring down the systemic barriers that exclude disabled people and fight for the rights to be recognised. Climate justice is also social justice, and ableism has to be situated within climate justice discourse. And People with disabilities, especially those living in poverty, are among those hardest hit by climate change. People with disabilities are more likely to live in areas prone to disasters because they're more likely to be poor. So we have this intersection between poverty and disability. They are 4 times more likely than those without disability to lose their lives as a result of natural disasters. The greatest threat and burden of climate change will fall on the world's poorest people, who have done the least to cause it. Ableism is a form of structural oppression and commonly intersects with poverty. When communities are forced to migrate due to rising sea levels, the reality is that it is often disabled people, women and children who get left behind. It is likely that we've only scratched the surface of climate injustice and what being on the sharp end of it entails. Now, if this is true about climate change and gender, it's even more true of climate change and disability. There just isn't enough research about how climate change impacts women and girls of colour, and even less so disabled people, which is a big part of the problem. In the spirit of accompaniment, it's really important not only to tell the truth about climate change being ableist, but to appreciate that it's structural oppression that disables, not inherent vulnerability. We are in fact all adrift, and we've created a lot of room for unchecked unconscious bias, gaslighting, marginalised people, and turning away from the truth of the injustices they face. How much truth can you bear? Said Nietzsche. And it seems that the answer is not that much. But the point is that we have a choice, and marginalised people do not. They have no choice but to bear whatever injustices come their way. Marginalised people have to fight far too hard for crumbs in this toxic environment because, as academic Cynthia Moe-Labida acknowledges, we do not have conceptual frameworks for holding ourselves accountable for the cumulative impact of complex historical dynamics that continue into the present, benefit us, and have terrible impacts on others and on future generations, yet involve no individual's actions that are deemed either criminally or morally wrong. So we have some more examples here of structural oppression and how that plays out in my own experience as well as what I've read. Deviating from pathways that invalidate agency and disempower through the prism of vulnerability, this section looks at reframing vulnerability and agency at all levels of change, from grassroots to the top echelons of decision-making. We may not be able to change the world all at once, but we can build microclimates in our own communities that are more inclusive and equitable, consciously taking heed of the vast areas of expertise that people have cultivated on the margins of society, with open minds in the spirit of accompaniment. Shifting the balance of power, stepping away from privileged dominance towards authentic humility is what's next. Refusing to be the mouthpiece and declining to be the leader when those from the community are quite able to do so themselves, says Mary Watkins. We in the global north have a part to play in climate justice, but it isn't the leading role. We are ill-equipped to understand and respond to climate breakdown. But we can work on humility and collaborative servitude in the spirit of accompaniment. Even if we do not interact in person, our spirits are connected and our interests converge. Climate breakdown affects us in the global north too, starting with people living on the margins of our local communities. Radical systems overhaul from the grassroots, the spirit of accompaniment in action. This section looks at ideas and their underpinnings for practical action. Reparations, language, the concept of calling in, speaking up, and learning to walk side by side, learning to see climate justice as a form of enlightened self-interest even. The words of Helen Minnis for her Swarthmore lecture, who talks of perceiving, not influencing the temperature of the water. This really resonates, I think, with the spirit of accompaniment. So this last section, taking care, recognising what the spirit of accompaniment is not. We have seen that the spirit of accompaniment in the context of climate justice necessarily involves anti-racism, anti-misogyny, and anti-ableism. All that we've discovered about power imbalances, epistemic supremacy, and humility depends on being mindful of our own limitations. This is because climate justice is racial justice, is gender justice, is justice for disabled people. It is not about us. So let's not centre conversations about the spirit of accompaniment on ourselves and how well we perceive ourselves to be doing. In this section, I look at the white saviour complex and the way in which it harms marginalised people and even ourselves. I include an in-depth exploration of the dangers outlined by Olufemi Taiwo of standpoint epistemology and deference politics. I then explore further into using language with care, including how justice is not charity, before going on to think about the nature of mistakes as a necessary condition for personal transformation. The spirit of accompaniment requires us to expect to make mistakes and to be what Mary Watkins refers to as called in, so privately in the context of trusted dialogue from the get-go, and to try to be gracious when it happens. Finally, the complex and sensitive question of allyship, whether or not this is possible and its relation to the spirit of accompaniment. I have found allyship to be a contentious concept, and for good reason. I can now appreciate that it was a confusion between allyship and the spirit of accompaniment that fueled my initial skepticism. Our collaborative goal in the spirit of accompaniment is not only one of working out how we can deviate from our existing pathways, but to construct new pathways that will liberate everyone from privilege and corresponding oppression respectively. This can only be achieved by nurturing horizontal relationships. This has repercussions for how we treat others in terms of projections of power from above through pity and the white saviour complex, but also being mindful that turning this unhealthy vertical relationship on its head by wallowing in guilt and shame and deferring to marginalised people at negotiating tables will force marginalised people to carry burdens that we caused alone, putting them at significant risk of traumatic harm. In this research, I've tried performatively to show what might be possible and by what methods in what I've been calling the spirit of accompaniment. I have listened, I've read, I've misunderstood, I've reread, I've borne witness to truths about climate justice, examined my own spirit, taken risks. I've made countless mistakes, dived back in again, cross-referenced ideas, I've learned, I've changed. As our friend Tracy Martin, As our friend Tracy Martin concludes in her talk entitled Walking Side by Side, Accompanying, Listening and Working Together, we can and should commit ourselves in our own work to dismantling oppressive structures and changing oppressive processes. And her questions that follow capture the enduring quality of the spirit of accompaniment. For as Quakers, we, in Tracy's words, can all keep asking ourselves, are we walking side by side here? What more can we do? The spirit of accompaniment is in the context of climate justice is the declaration that I can hear you and the commitment to keep listening and responding. I accept the existence of the climate crisis and how this is enmeshed in a systemic entanglement of racism, gender and disability inequality. I openly accept my own responsibility to put the work in that's required to stop sitting back in collusion with intersecting systems of inequality. And I will commit to speaking truth to power or holding those in the light who do so, actively supporting our shared goals as it unfolds in real time. I will stay present and recalibrate my life as a conscious, ongoing learning experience. I'll keep listening, keep reading, keep asking questions. I will try not to falter by slipping back into old unconscious habits, bringing them back into the light of consciousness through an evolving vocabulary of liberation. Yes, I will try in earnest not to falter, but when I inevitably do, I'll resist the temptation to be defensive, be kind to myself, try again and keep trying. Humility is a necessary condition for the spirit of accompaniment, but it's not sufficient. Because it involves a fluidly dynamic relationship of stepping up and stepping down in collaboration with others. Justice in the spirit of accompaniment asks that we learn together, we listen together, and we do what's in our power together from different levels of privilege or advantage to construct a better world for everyone. And that's in the words of Olufemi Taiwo, that last quote. As Quakers, we can hope to start centering marginalised friends and communities in our local areas to stand closer together in our ongoing spiritual growth, always making room to welcome people from the margins of society in ways that are meaningful to them, from their lenses, adopting their priorities, rather than what we think they want or need. Accessible meeting houses, accessible in every sense of the term, are important, but just a start. In the spirit of joyful accompaniment, as well as allowing ourselves to be welcomed onto pathways that we are not used to, we can actively nurture microclimates of change within our local communities. I have spoken to so many Quakers who are already doing this, which is a big part of what drew me to our faith in the first place. There isn't one way to be a Quaker, and I believe that we are well placed to cultivate the spirit of accompaniment through our own interlacing prisms of faith. This is because they are rooted in the core values that underpin the way we worship. Compassionate listening involves the total engagement of the heart, says Kathy Tweets in 1993. It is through strength and grace that we are unable to achieve trust and spiritual intimacy. What is a friend without the spirit of accompaniment? Is this not the very essence of friendship itself? Friends to each other, but also friends of truth, which often involves challenge. Challenging people in power, recognizing and challenging white power narratives, but also challenging complicity in our smaller meetings, which can be problematic unless we are committed to walk on anti-racist paths and building the trust and humility necessary to accompany each other, taking each other's hands when we slip up. Our pathways are not equal, and we should be honest about that. But we should strive to walk alongside each other in the spirit of accompaniment, because we need each other in order to start processes of spiritual and structural transformation, transformative co-creation, to become who we are, finding ourselves in each other and each other in ourselves. The call for climate justice speaks to each one of us, because until we're all okay, none of us are. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce Naomi Richards, who attends Redland Meeting in Bristol. And Naomi is going to be talking to us about sharing food to cultivate belonging to and reverence for all life on earth.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you, Ruth, for your presentation. I'm going to start with a question, and I would invite people to respond just in the chat with just one word of what comes into your mind when you see this question. And the question is, how do conversations about the climate crisis make you feel? Thank you. It's an interesting mix of words there, but I'm seeing powerless, defensive, challenged, worried, hopeful, anxious, daunted, angry and despairing, interested, outraged, prioritizing, difficult, relief, awkward. Yeah, I mean, this project for me started from, I guess, my own feelings in response to conversations about the climate crisis. And for me, I found that I often left conversations feeling quite despairing and hopeless and overwhelmed. I think because the climate crisis is something that is on such a big scale and affects us all, as Ruth has so eloquently articulated, it affects us all so differently, and we're all in such different positions in relation to it, that I felt like there was nothing that I could do as an individual to actually have a real impact on something so big. But I've also found that the times when I'm feeling the most hopeless and despairing is usually the times when I'm not doing something. And that actually, in the times when I start just doing something, however small that is in some way a response to this bigger question, are the times when I start to feel hopeful. And for me, I think hope is really a verb and not a noun, and it's something that is an active thing that comes from doing. And I think that shifting this in my mind to see hope as something that is an active thing also allows me to explore something without needing to have an answer, and without needing to kind of lay out an outcome of how I'm going to solve the climate crisis, but rather to engage in it, and for that to be enough to keep me feeling hopeful. And so my project kind of came out of that, trying to find places where I could feel like I was doing something and that I felt hopeful. And so something that I love is food. I love cooking, and I love sharing food with people. And I've worked with different projects that use sharing food as a way of building community. And I've been really inspired by that, and seeing the way that food can bring people together. But I was also interested in how that could connect to the climate crisis. And so I'm just going to read a little bit of something that I wrote about the connection between food, the climate crisis, and Quakers. How do we center community and relationships in times of crisis? Given the urgency of this issue, the climate crisis, what does it mean to slow down and take time for nourishment? Traditionally, rituals happen in set-aside spaces and times outside of the mundane. Given Quakers' testimony that every day is sacred, how might we hold something as sacred, even and especially when it is mundane or everyday? Food sits at the intersection of sacred and profane, personal and universal, and compels us to reconsider these dichotomies. As Quakers, we are committed to creating spaces which are equitable and within which all voices are heard. However, that ideal is not always a reality. Placing food at the center of a Quaker practice might offer an implicit reminder of the necessity of our bodies and places and inclusion in our work. When we sit and eat together, we might find different ways of being together that cultivate belonging. Food is inherently welcoming. Our togetherness is something physical and time-bound on Earth. Eating together can remind us of this. When we bridge natural and social ecologies, we can take better account of the ethics of mutuality, the recognition that we are all interconnected, and the responsibilities that this carries. What does our testimony to sustainability demand of us? What are the spiritual and practical implications of this? What is our role? How are we in or out of right relationship with ourselves, one another, and the wider Earth? Okay, I'm going to share my screen quickly. Oops. Yeah, so as I mentioned, I was inspired by various different food-related things that I have been involved in, some of which was connected with Quakers, like helping host peace feasts at Quaker meeting houses, as well as working with a community kitchen running cooking classes with refugee chefs. And yeah, I found that I was really inspired by the way that this was bringing people together around food, but I wanted to kind of widen those circles a little bit further to include considerations of the wider Earth and the climate crisis. And so this is kind of the visualization that I had in my mind of the way that food kind of sits in the middle of these three sections of something that can be spiritual, something that is connected to the earth, like the food that we eat comes from the earth, and something that also connects to community when we eat together. So the process was I decided to experiment with this and to host meals with conversations about the climate crisis with groups of Quakers. And I did this kind of in 2 different formats, one of which was more of a kind of hosted and facilitated structured event in which I would plan a menu and cook everything, and very much guide a conversation throughout the process of a meal. And this I found worked really well with having a smaller group and feeling like there was a kind of collective group experience. And then the other way that I did it was through my local meeting. Redland has a sharing lunch every month. And so I asked to bring this to our sharing lunch. And in some ways it was much more of a lightly facilitated thing, in that I just bought a few different dishes and questions that connected to those dishes to the sharing lunch, and invited people with drawing materials on the tables to have conversations around the questions that were on each table, that connected to the food that was on the table and also to wider questions about the climate crisis. I think something that really stood out to me through doing the research was the importance of kind of laying the ground to have a conversation, that in order to have conversations about things like the climate crisis, which can be so big and overwhelming and can also be personally confronting in some ways, because they ask us to kind of consider our lifestyles, our ways of being, and this kind of thing, that to be able to have those kind of uncomfortable conversations, people kind of need a level of comfort to begin with. And so something that really stood out to me through doing the research was, yeah, just the importance of having an already established sense of community in order to begin those conversations. And that something that I really noticed with doing doing it at the sharing lunch was that because there was this already established tradition of having this lunch together, and people had relationships and connections already established through that, that there was almost already a level of community, and so that beginning to have those conversations, people felt ready for it. And so something that I talk about in the kind of booklet that I made with some thoughts and ideas about ways that people might host similar events with their own meeting was the suggestion of beginning with just sharing food and not needing to have a conversation about anything bigger in particular, and already starting with that and then working into having bigger conversations about bigger questions and topics. So yeah, this is a example of, this is the menu that I made for one of the meetings that we had at Nailsworth Meeting House in Gloucestershire. And so I kind of tried to also use my creativity, because I think I really enjoy being creative, and I think that having a creative approach to something can maybe spark different ideas and conversations, and can also maybe allow people to enter into something from a slightly a less logical and analytical standpoint, and be more creative maybe in their responses. So I created 4 dishes, each of which kind of was connected to a question relating to the climate crisis, and also relating to the food that was being served, and then asked people to kind of have conversations around these whilst they were eating. And yeah, I guess through the process, I wanted to create something that people could actually use, and so I decided to make a kind of booklet to offer suggestions and ideas and reflections on what I feel like I've learned through trying this out, in order that other people might be able to try doing something similar with their own Quaker community. So this is the booklet that I made, and it's sort of in different sections. So beginning with a bit of context about what the idea was and how I went about doing it, talking a bit more about the relationship between Quakers, climate and food, and how those three things can link together in a practical sense. Talking about the importance of community, which is kind of what I've just been talking about this idea of sort of laying the groundwork in order to have more challenging conversations. I then talk a bit about inclusivity and creativity, and that's kind of thinking about how to create an event that is welcoming and inviting for everyone. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to use food, because I think food can be a really welcoming and inviting way to bring people in. It's always a nice feeling to be invited to a dinner or something like that, and so to kind of try and create that feeling whilst having these other kinds of conversations, and also using creativity and having different ways for people to engage in something. So I understand that for some people and for different ages, that having verbal conversations isn't always their way of communicating most effectively. And so it was also nice experimenting with using creative materials and having papers on the table that people could engage with if they wanted to, as a different way of participating. I then used some of the questions that I asked when I was doing these myself, and a few others of suggestions of questions that people could ask along with meals that they might serve. And yeah, these are just open-ended questions to start conversations. And of course, having questions that feel like they fit with a group that you're working with, whether that's your local meeting or climate group. I think it's really important to kind of tailor whatever you're doing to the specific context that you're working in. And then I reflected a little bit on how to kind of keep this conversation going and hopefully moving into action, and also continuing to work on maintaining a community around this. And I think that was really the kind of biggest takeaway from this project, was that in some sense what I was really trying to do was building community and almost seeing building relationships as being more important than having an outcome, because even just observing some of the conversations that were happening at the meals, what was going on was people were making connections, and they were maybe talking about projects and things that they were involved in relating to the climate change, but it was this act of actually sitting together at a table and seeing what other people are doing and what other people are interested in, that these connections were happening, and maybe those connections lead to action, but that it's the actual making of the connections that felt important, and that actually that making of relationships is another thing that gives me hope, is seeing that I'm not the only person in this, and even just the recognition that there are others in this is also something that gives me hope. And so it kind of came to this sort of full circle of hope being action, but then action being relationships, which then in turn was hope. And so action not necessarily being something that is tangible or an outcome, but is also about building connections and community, and that act of sitting and eating a meal together, I hope, does that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Yeah, and yeah, I would just also like to say thank you to everyone that made this project possible, with the support that I had from Woodbrooke and the other scholars, and from Charisse, and also for everyone that came and participated in the meals and offered their feedback and their participation. Yeah, I think that's enough from me for now.
Thank you, Naomi. And thank you both for such refreshingly unique journeys, exploring interconnection and deepening our listening and sustaining our communities when we're facing such emotive issues. So yeah, thank you to everyone for your contributions and questions and your presence today, and thanks also to the tutors who've supported our scholars throughout their projects, and today's speakers were supported by Charisse Bock and Tracy Martin, who are here.